The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the quiet suburban street. It was the kind of day that felt like a gift, a perfect slice of peace in a busy world. For the man on the black motorcycle, it was everything. He wasn't a movie star right now, not a face on a poster or a character on a screen. He was just a rider, feeling the gentle vibration of the engine beneath him, a steady thrum that matched the rhythm of his own heart. The wind had been a companion on the road, a playful force tugging at his jacket and whipping through his hair when he allowed it. But now, as he slowed, it softened to a warm caress. He breathed in the smell of cut grass from a nearby lawn and the faint, sweet scent of honeysuckle mixed with the hot asphalt. It was the simple, honest smell of a real day. He spotted the small cafe nestled between a bookstore and a closed-down tailor shop. It looked like it had been there for decades, a little haven of comfort with its faded red awning and checkered curtains in the windows. A chalkboard stood on the sidewalk written in a cheerful, looping script that advertised today's special homemade lemon cake. This was his destination. Not a fancy restaurant or a trendy hotspot, but a place that promised a good cup of coffee and a moment of anonymity. He was just looking for that small pocket of normalcy, a chance to sit and watch the world go by without being a part of the spectacle, maneuvering his bike with an easy, practiced grace. He guided it into an empty parking spot right near the cafe's entrance. The spot was perfect, offering a clear view of the street from a small outdoor table. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt profound. The world, which had been a blur of motion and sound, snapped into sharp, quiet focus. He swung his leg over the seat and dismounted, his movements fluid and unhurried. He pulled off his helmet, holding it under his arm like a familiar old friend. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the slight dampness of sweat from the ride, and tilted his face up to the sun for a moment, just enjoying the warmth on his skin. A small, contented smile touched his lips. This was it. This was the feeling he had been chasing all day. That's when he heard it. It started as a distant hum, a low-frequency buzz that was more of a feeling in the chest than a sound in the ears. He didn't think much of it at first. Just another part of the background noise of the world. But the hum didn't fade. It grew steadily and surely, morphing from a buzz into a guttural rumble that seemed to shake the very ground. The peaceful atmosphere of the street began to fray at the edges. The sound was aggressive, a statement of pure, unadulterated power that tore through the quiet afternoon like a siren. He turned his head, his eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the road. Around the corner they appeared. It wasn't one or two bikes, but a pack. A moving wall of leather, denim, and gleaming chrome that filled the street from one curb to the other. The sunlight glinted off polished handlebars and the intricate, custom paint jobs on the gas tanks. They were a parade of noise and attitude, their massive engines roaring in a deafening chorus that announced their arrival long before they reached the cafe. Each rider was a picture of rugged individuality, yet they moved as a single cohesive unit. A force of nature rolling down the asphalt. The few people on the sidewalk stopped and stared, their conversations dying in their throats. A mother pulled her child a little closer. The world seemed to hold its breath. The pack of bikers didn't just drive into the parking lot. They invaded it. They circled once, a slow, predatory loop that was clearly meant to claim the territory. It was a power move, a silent warning that they were now in charge. The man on the black motorcycle stood perfectly still, his helmet tucked under his arm, his relaxed posture from moments ago now gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful stillness. He was no longer just a man enjoying a coffee break. He was an observer, assessing a sudden and dramatic change in his environment. Finally, their circling complete, the bikes began to park, not neatly, but with a kind of chaotic dominance, taking up multiple spaces and blocking parts of the driveway. One by one, the thunderous engines were shut down. The roar was replaced by a series of coughs and backfires, and then an abrupt and heavy silence fell over the lot. This silence was somehow more intimidating than the noise had been. It was thick with unspoken tension and the lingering smell of exhaust fumes. The air, which had smelled of grass and sunshine just minutes before, now tasted of gasoline and raw power. the riders began to dismount. They were big men, their shoulders broad under their leather vests, their faces weathered and serious. They moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, removing their helmets and gloves, their boots crunching on the gravel. They didn't look at the cafe or at the few other people in the lot. Their eyes were fixed on him, on the man with the simple jacket and the quiet motorcycle who had been there first, sitting peacefully in what they now clearly considered their space. The golden afternoon no longer felt peaceful. It felt charged, electric, and dangerously uncertain. The man stood his ground, his expression unreadable, as the largest of the group. A man with a thick, graying beard and patches sewn onto his vest started walking directly toward him. The man with the thick, graying beard moved with a heavy, deliberate rhythm. His boots, scuffed and worn from 1,000 miles of road, crunched on the loose gravel of the parking lot with each step. It was a sound that seemed to mark time, slowing the world down and drawing all attention to him. He was the leader, that much was obvious. It wasn't just the road captain patch on his worn leather vest, but the way he carried himself. His shoulders were squared, his back straight, and his gaze was fixed and unwavering. He walked like a man who expected the world to part for him, and for the most part it probably did. As he closed the distance, the man on the motorcycle could see the details etched into his face, deep lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, a network of wrinkles that spoke of years of laughter and scowls in equal measure. His beard was long and braided in 2 places, with small faded leather ties holding it together. He wasn't just old, he was weathered, like a cliff face that had stood against the wind and sea for a lifetime. Flanking him were 2 more of his crew, moving in perfect sync. They spread out slightly as they approached, creating a kind of moving triangle that was impossible to ignore. It was a classic intimidation tactic, a way to corner a person both physically and psychologically. One was tall and lanky, with arms covered in a blur of tattoos that seemed to merge into one another. The other was shorter but built like a fire plug, thick and solid, his neck disappearing into his powerful shoulders. They didn't say anything, but their presence was a loud, clear message. They were a wall, and the man on the motorcycle was on the wrong side of it. The leader stopped a few feet away, close enough that the man on the motorcycle could smell the faint scent of old leather, sweat, and the lingering trace of exhaust fumes that clung to him like a second skin. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't nod. He simply lifted a gloved hand and pointed a thick, calloused finger at the empty parking space. "That's our spot," he grunted. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. A judgment. The man on the motorcycle was genuinely taken aback. For a moment, his mind flickered to the possibility that this was an overly aggressive fan, someone who didn't know how to approach a celebrity. But the look in the leader's eyes wasn't one of admiration. It was hard, challenging, and devoid of any recognition. This wasn't about a movie. This was about something much more primal. He quickly abandoned that thought and focused on the man in front of him. He saw no reason for conflict, no need for drama. It was a simple misunderstanding, easily fixed. "Oh, my apologies," he said, his voice even and calm. He held up his hands in a placating gesture, a universal sign of peace. "I didn't see any marking." "I can move it." He gestured with his helmet toward another empty spot a little further down the row, a perfectly good space that was just as convenient. It was a simple, logical solution, a reasonable offer from one reasonable person to another, but the leader wasn't looking for reasonable. He sneered, his upper lip curling back to reveal stained teeth. He was unimpressed by the polite response, the quick apology. In his world, politeness could be a sign of weakness, a way of backing down. He wasn't interested in backing down. He was interested in establishing dominance. "You see us now, don't you?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He took another step forward, shrinking the space between them even more. "Think you can just take whatever you want?" The man on the motorcycle felt a subtle shift inside him. The peaceful, contented feeling from his ride was completely gone, replaced by a cool, focused clarity. He understood now that this wasn't about a parking spot. It was about respect, or the perceived lack of it. This was a performance for the other bikers, a way for the leader to assert his authority in front of his crew. He tried again, his voice losing a little of its softness and gaining a quiet, firm edge. "It was an honest mistake," he stated, his eyes meeting the leader's without flinching. "There's another spot over there. I'll just, He didn't get to finish his sentence. The leader cut him off, stepping so close now that their chests were almost touching. He loomed over the man on the motorcycle, using his height and bulk to his advantage, casting a shadow that blotted out the warm afternoon sun. "We don't want another spot," he growled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the air between them. "We want you to understand some manners." The words were a direct challenge, a gauntlet thrown down on the hot asphalt. The air grew thick with unspoken threats. The two flanking bikers took a half-step closer, their postures tense and ready. It was a classic pincer movement, a physical and psychological trap designed to make their target feel small and powerless. A few people leaving the cafe slowed their steps, their eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and fear. They sensed the potential for violence, the raw energy crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. One woman quickly ushered her child back inside, the door swinging shut with a soft jingle of bells that seemed strangely out of place. The man on the motorcycle's friendly demeanor had completely receded. It wasn't replaced by anger or fear, but by a profound and unnerving stillness. He was like a calm, deep lake that had just been disturbed. The ripples on the surface were small, but you knew something powerful was stirring in the depths below. He stood his ground, his feet planted firmly, his body relaxed but coiled like a spring. He was no longer trying to de-escalate. He was now simply waiting. That's when one of the other bikers, the one built like a fire plug, decided to escalate things further. Emboldened by his leader's aggression and the man's quiet lack of fear, he saw his chance to prove his own loyalty and toughness. He stepped forward and shoved the man on the motorcycle lightly on the shoulder. It wasn't a hard push, not meant to injure but to insult, to provoke. "He's talking to you, pretty boy," the biker sneered, a cruel smirk on his face. It was a critical mistake. The man on the motorcycle didn't stagger. He didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to move. He simply absorbed the contact, his body absorbing the force of the shove as if it were nothing more than a gust of wind. His feet didn't shift an inch. His head didn't bob. It was as if the biker had shoved a brick wall. The entire atmosphere shifted in that single frozen moment. The air, which had been thick with tension, now became icy, heavy, and dangerous. It was as if a switch had been flipped inside the man. The bikers, who had been all bluster and bravado, suddenly felt a primal chill run down their spines. The man before them hadn't changed, but something about him had become intensely focused, like a predator that had just been alerted to the presence of prey. His eyes, which had been open and reasonable, narrowed slightly, and for the first time, the leader saw a flicker of something in their depths that was not calm, not reasonable, and not afraid at all. It was something cold, hard, and utterly lethal. The world seemed to freeze in that single, stretched-out moment after the shove. The stocky biker's hand was still in the air, his fingers curled from the push. He had expected a reaction. He had rehearsed this scene 100 times in his head. The shove, the stumble, the angry words, the escalation that would end with the stranger backing down, maybe even apologizing for his mere presence. It was a script he knew by heart, a power play that had always worked before. But this was different. The man on the motorcycle didn't stumble. He didn't even sway. He stood there, rooted to the spot as if his feet had grown deep into the asphalt beneath him. The lack of any reaction was more jarring than a punch in the face would have been. It was a void, a complete and total absence of the response the biker had been trying to provoke. A slow, creeping dread began to crawl up the back of his neck. His sneer faltered, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated confusion. The leader saw it all. He saw the foolishness of his crewman's action and the unnerving stillness of the man they had cornered. He had wanted to teach a lesson in respect, to put a stranger in his place. But the stranger wasn't in his place. The stranger was in a place the leader didn't understand, a place of absolute calm that felt more dangerous than any rage. The leader felt a prickle of sweat on his own brow, despite the coolness of the sudden shade. He was the one in charge, the one who was supposed to control the situation. But control was slipping through his fingers like sand. He tried to reclaim it, to force the narrative back to the one he understood. "You got a problem, friend?" he asked, his voice a little too loud, a little too forced. The word friend hung in the air, hollow and sarcastic. The man on the motorcycle still didn't speak. He just looked at the leader, his gaze unwavering. It was a look that held no anger, no fear, no emotion at all. It was a flat, assessing stare, the kind a doctor might give a particularly puzzling X-ray, or a mechanic might give a complex engine. He was analyzing, not reacting. The silence stretched, becoming a physical presence in the parking lot. The distant sounds of the neighborhood, a dog barking, a lawnmower running, seemed to fade away, leaving only the heavy, oppressive quiet that had fallen over the three bikers and their unexpected opponent. The air, which had been warm and pleasant just minutes ago, now felt cold and thin, making it difficult to breathe. It was the tall, lanky biker with the tattooed arms who felt the change most profoundly. He was a step back from the others, an observer as much as a participant. From his vantage point, he could see the subtle shift in the man on the motorcycle. It wasn't anything big, not a clenching of fists or a tensing of muscles. It was something deeper. It was in the way the man's weight settled perfectly over his feet, creating an unshakable center of gravity. It was in the way his shoulders, which had been relaxed, now settled into a line that was both loose and ready. It was the look in his eyes. The tall biker had seen that look once before, years ago, in the face of a soldier who had seen too much. It wasn't the look of a man looking for a fight. It was the look of a man for whom a fight was simply a problem to be solved with brutal efficiency. A cold knot of fear tightened in the tall biker's stomach. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they had made a catastrophic mistake. The stocky biker, the one who had shoved, finally lowered his hand. He took a half-step back, his bravado completely gone, replaced by a palpable fear. He couldn't meet the man's eyes anymore, his gaze darting down to the man's boots, then to the cracked pavement, anywhere but at that face, which now seemed like a mask of cold stone. He felt like a child who had just poked a sleeping bear and was now realizing it wasn't a teddy bear. He had acted out of ego, a desire to impress his leader. And now he had led them all into a trap of his own making. The leader, seeing the fear in his crewman's eyes, felt a surge of panic. His authority was crumbling. If he didn't do something, if he didn't reassert his dominance, he would lose the respect of his men. He took a step forward, trying to close the distance again, trying to intimidate the man with his size and his reputation. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice a low growl, trying to inject some of his former menace into it. "You deaf?" That was the moment. The man on the motorcycle moved. It wasn't a big movement. It was small, almost imperceptible. He just tilted his head slightly, a tiny, bird-like motion. But it was a movement that spoke volumes. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated dismissal, as if the leader's words were the buzzing of an annoying insect that he had just noticed. It was a look that said, "I heard you. I just don't care." And then, his eyes, which had been focused on the leader, slowly shifted to the stocky biker who had shoved him. He didn't look at him with anger. He looked at him with a kind of clinical curiosity, the way a scientist might look at a specimen under a microscope. It was a look that stripped the man of his humanity, reducing him to a problem, a variable in an equation. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The stocky biker physically flinched, as if he had been struck. He took another step back, his hands coming up slightly, palms out, and a gesture of surrender. The leader saw it, and he knew the game was over. He saw the look on his friend's face, a look of pure terror. He saw the way the tall biker was shaking his head almost imperceptibly, a silent signal to back off. The pack was broken. The unity they projected was a sham, shattered by the quiet, unnerving presence of one single man. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. The man on the motorcycle still hadn't said a word. He didn't have to. His silence was a weapon. His stillness was a threat. He had not thrown a single punch, not raised his voice, not made a single aggressive move. He had simply stood there and let their own aggression and fear consume them. He had absorbed their energy and reflected it back at them, amplified and distorted into something monstrous. The leader opened his mouth to say something, to try and de-escalate, to find a way out of this mess, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his tongue felt like a piece of leather. He was trapped, not by physical force, but by a force of will that was far more powerful. He was looking into the eyes of the Baba Yaga, and he was just now beginning to understand what that meant. The silence in the parking lot had become a physical thing. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the sounds of the street and pressed down on the three bikers, making it hard to draw a full breath. The leader, the man with the graying beard, felt it most of all. He was frozen, his mouth half open, the words he had intended to use to reclaim control dying on his tongue. His mind, usually a toolbox of quick insults and threats, was completely empty. All he could do was stare into the eyes of the man before him, eyes that were not angry or hateful, but something far worse. They were analytical, detached, as if they were looking right through him, cataloging his every weakness, his every fear. He felt like a bug pinned to a board, a specimen under a microscope, and the scientist holding the microscope was deciding whether to dissect him or just throw him in the trash. The stocky biker who had initiated the shove was still in a state of shock. He had taken another step back and was now standing with his hands held up in front of him, palms out in a gesture of pure, unthinking surrender. He wasn't looking at the man's face anymore. He couldn't. His gaze was fixed on the man's chest, on the simple jacket he wore, as if he were trying to memorize the stitching. He was trying to make himself small, to become invisible, to erase the last few minutes from existence. He had acted out of a foolish sense of pride, a need to prove something to his leader and his crew. And now he had led them all to the edge of a cliff he couldn't even see. The tall, lanky biker with the tattooed arms was the only one who seemed to have a sliver of awareness left. He was watching the whole scene with a dawning horror. He could see the subtle shift in the air, the way the man's presence seemed to suck all the confidence and bravado out of his friends. He had felt that kind of fear before, a long time ago, in a dark alley behind a bar. It was the primal fear of a predator, the understanding that you were no longer at the top of the food chain. He wanted to say something, to tell his leader to back down, to just get on their bikes and leave, but his throat was tight and no sound would come out. He was just as trapped as the others, a spectator to his own undoing. That's when the bell over the cafe door jingled. A light, cheerful sound that was completely out of place in the heavy silence. It was like a tiny, foolish laugh in the middle of a funeral. A young woman who had been watching the entire confrontation from the safety of the doorway stepped out onto the sidewalk. She had been holding a cup of coffee, but now her hand was frozen halfway to her lips, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. She wasn't looking at the bikers. Her gaze was locked on the man in the middle of the confrontation, the man who had not moved a muscle. The sound of the bell broke the spell, just for a second. The leader's eyes flickered toward the woman, a flash of annoyance in them. This was his show, his moment of dominance, and this outsider was interrupting it. But the woman didn't see his annoyance. She was too captivated by the scene in front of her. She saw the quiet intensity of the man, the way he held himself, the familiar set of his jaw, the gentle sadness in his eyes that was now masked by a cold, hard focus. It was a face she had seen 100 times on a screen, but this was different. This was real. This was raw. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but in the dead quiet of the parking lot, it was as loud as a gunshot. The words hung in the air, fragile and full of wonder. That's Keanu Reeves." The name meant nothing to the leader at first. It was just a sound, a weird noise in the background of his personal nightmare. Keanu Reeves? Who was that? Some guy from the neighborhood? He didn't care. His focus was on the man in front of him, the man who was still looking at him with those cold, dead eyes. He tried to muster up a response, to get back to the business of intimidation, but the name had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. The tall, lanky biker, however, heard the name and his head snapped toward the woman. Keanu Reeves. The name was familiar, a tickle at the back of his brain. He had heard it before, on TV and magazines. A movie star. But that didn't make sense. Movie stars were thin, pretty boys who lived in mansions, not quiet. Dangerous men who could freeze three hardened bikers with a single look. He shook his head, trying to clear it. It couldn't be, but the stocky biker, the one who was still in a state of terror, had also heard. And for him, the connection was instant. He was younger than the others, a fan of action movies, of fast cars and bigger explosions. He had seen the posters. He had watched the movies. The name, the face, the quiet, coiled energy. It all clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. His blood ran cold. He looked from the man's steely gaze back to the image in his mind. The image of a man in a black suit, holding a pistol, with the words "John Wick" above his head. "Wait," he stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. The other two bikers turned to look at him, surprised that he had found his voice. He was looking at the man on the motorcycle, his eyes wide with dawning horror. Like John Wick? The name hit the leader like a punch to the gut. John Wick, the Baba Yaga, the boogeyman. He had seen the movies, too. He had laughed at them, at the over-the-top violence, at the ridiculous idea of one man taking on an entire army of killers. But he wasn't laughing now. He looked back at the man in front of him, really looked at him and saw it. The stillness, the calm, the sheer, unbothered confidence. It wasn't an act. It wasn't a movie character. It was real. The man on the screen was just a reflection of the man standing in front of him. The blood drained from his face, and he felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. They hadn't just cornered some random guy on a motorcycle. They had been threatening the Baba Yaga himself. The leader took an involuntary half-step back, his hands coming up in a gesture of surrender that mimicked his friend's. The aggressive sneer was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated fear. His authority, his pride, his entire worldview had just been shattered by a single name. He was no longer the predator. He was the prey, and he had just looked into the eyes of the apex predator. The pack was broken, their dominance a forgotten dream, and all that was left was the overwhelming, terrifying reality of their mistake. The name hung in the air between them, a single, syllabic bomb that had just detonated in the center of their world. John Wick. The leader felt the blood drain from his face so quickly that a dizzying wave of nausea washed over him. His reputation, built over years of riding and posturing, of being the toughest guy in the room, was crumbling into dust at his feet. All the authority, all the respect he commanded from his crew, it was all a house of cards, and this man, this quiet, unassuming man on a motorcycle, had just blown on it. He felt like a child who had been playing with a toy sword, only to realize he had just challenged a real soldier to a duel. The reality of their situation crashed down on him with the weight of a physical blow. They hadn't just been rude. They had been threatening. They had shoved him. They had cornered him. They had poked the bear, and the bear was not just a bear. It was the myth, the legend, the one you send to kill the boogeymen, the leader's shoulders, which had been squared with aggressive confidence just moments before, slumped forward. The hard, challenging look in his eyes melted away, replaced by a raw, undisguised fear. He couldn't meet the man's gaze anymore. His eyes dropped to the ground, to the cracked asphalt at his own feet, as if he were searching for a crack to open up and swallow him whole. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was tight, and all that came out was a dry, rasping sound. He swallowed hard, trying to find some moisture, trying to find the words that could possibly fix this monumental mistake. "Mr. Reeves, sir," he finally managed to stammer, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched squeak that was a shadow of its former gravelly growl. The words felt foreign and clumsy in his mouth. We had no idea." He looked up, his eyes pleading, hoping to see a flicker of something other than that cold, analytical stare. But the man's face was still a mask of unreadable calm. "We are so sorry. It was a stupid misunderstanding. We were just..." We were just messing around. It was a joke. The excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. It wasn't a joke. It was bullying. It was a pathetic attempt to feel powerful by making someone else feel small. And they had chosen the absolute worst person to try it on with. The stocky biker was nodding his head frantically, a silent, desperate agreement to his leader's words. He looked like he was about to cry. The tall, lanky biker just stood there, shaking his head slowly, his face pale. He was replaying the entire scene in his head, seeing it now through a new lens. The man's stillness wasn't weakness. It was control. The lack of reaction wasn't fear. It was patience. They had been so blind, so arrogant. They had seen a man on a nice bike and thought he was an easy target, a soft city dweller they could push around. They had seen the surface and completely missed the ocean of depth beneath it, the man on the motorcycle. Keanu Reeves watched them for a long, silent moment. He let their apologies hang in the air, let their shame settle in. He didn't rush to forgive them. He just stood there, his presence a quiet but undeniable force, letting the weight of their mistake press down on them. It was a lesson, delivered not with a fist, but with silence. Then, just as suddenly as the intense, dangerous focus had appeared, it vanished. It was like a storm cloud passing, revealing the calm, clear sky behind it. The tension in his shoulders eased. The hard line of his jaw softened. The coldness in his eyes melted away, replaced by the familiar, gentle warmth that the world knew from 1,000 interviews and movie premieres. He was no longer the Baba Yaga, he was just a man again. A small, forgiving smile touched his lips. It was a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. It was a smile that held no malice, no anger, no triumph. It was just a simple, kind expression. "Hey, it's all right," he said, his voice warm and relaxed. The same voice he had used at the very beginning of the encounter, before the world had turned upside down. "No harm done?" He looked at the three of them, his gaze moving from one to the next, and for the first time, they didn't feel like they were being judged. They felt like they were being seen. "We all have our days," he continued, his tone understanding and empathetic. "Sometimes those days are a little rougher than others." The bikers were stunned into silence. They had been expecting anger, or at the very least a cold dismissal. They had been prepared for a lecture, a public shaming, maybe even a call to the police. They were not prepared for grace. They were not prepared for forgiveness. It completely disarmed them, leaving them feeling more ashamed. And more humbled than any punishment could have, the man then did something that none of them could have ever predicted. He gestured toward the cafe with his helmet. "How about I buy you guys a coffee?" he offered, his smile widening slightly. To apologize for the confusion, the offer hung in the air, more shocking than the shove, more stunning than the realization of who he was. Buy them a coffee? He was apologizing to them? The leader's mind short-circuited. He couldn't process it. It was an act of kindness so profound, so unexpected, that it broke what was left of his tough guy facade. He felt a hot blush of shame creep up his neck. No, sir," he stammered, shaking his head vigorously. "We couldn't, we should be buying you coffee. We're the ones who... We're so sorry." The other two bikers were already backing away, shaking their heads, their hands held up as if to ward off the incredible kindness being offered to them. They couldn't accept it. It was too much. They didn't deserve it. All they wanted to do now was get away, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and this man who had shown them a side of strength they had never even knew existed. They mumbled a few more incoherent apologies, then practically tripped over themselves in their haste to get back to their bikes. The man just watched them go, his expression one of gentle amusement. He didn't try to stop them. He just stood there, a quiet figure in a parking lot that was once again bathed in the warm, peaceful light of the late afternoon sun. The roar of the bikers' engines started up one by one, but this time, the sound was different. It wasn't a roar of dominance and power. It was a frantic, high-pitched whine of escape. They peeled out of the parking lot, not with the slow, arrogant circle they had arrived in, but with a screech of tires and a cloud of smoke. Disappearing down the street as if the devil himself were on their tail, the man on the motorcycle shook his head slowly, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. He then turned, tucked his helmet under his arm, and walked calmly toward the café door. The young woman who had recognized him was still standing there, her mouth slightly agape. He gave her a small, polite nod as he passed her and pushed open the door. The little bell jingled, a cheerful, normal sound in a world that had just proven itself to be anything but. He walked up to the counter, ordered a simple black coffee, and found a small table by the window, finally getting the quiet moment he had been looking for all along. Outside, the legend of the day the boogeyman taught a lesson in kindness was already beginning to spread.